we're nearly at the end, so thank you very much. And finally, Professor Susan McVie is going to wind up the day and say something about AQMeN.
Yes.
Yeah, excuse me.
I thought it might just be useful. I mean, I know you've been sitting all day, you've been very patient, so I will not take up any more than 5 minutes. I just thought it might be useful to kind of just summarise some of the kind of key themes that emerge in terms of, from my perspective, throughout the day, and think about where we go next, because I kind of feel there's a lot of questions left hanging in the air a little bit. One of the kind of key things that I think has been highlighted by more than one speaker is this kind of conceptual shift or actual shift in terms of national to the local. So there are no longer these big national programme evaluations, that it's much more locally focused, more emphasis on developing and evaluating policy at the local level. I think, as Susan said, this has led from a shift to this kind of notion of a single intervention model to a conceptually different type of model, which is a local variation model. And also, as we heard from Rhys, there are many regional variations that we need to take account of in terms of policy. I think there are many ways in which evaluation can be carried out, and that's kind of been highlighted today, and the purpose of this wasn't to say, you know, these are all the different types of evaluation, but really, as Susan points out, one kind of fundamental point is that without good comparison or control groups, your results may not tell you anything, certainly won't necessarily tell you what you need to know. There's a real need, I think, emerging in terms of advice and support for local level services, people who are actually having to evaluate things on the ground. Stephen's obviously talked a lot about Evaluation Support Scotland, which for voluntary services is a great resource, but I wonder if there's a gap that's been identified today for local authorities here. Second thing that occurs to me is that issues of data, particularly data quality, not just in terms of the actual measures that we use, but some of the kind of concepts in terms of what we're trying to measure, that's a key issue. Data availability, it's evident that data is just simply not there to measure some of the outcomes that people are being asked to measure, especially in the context of devolution, not just at the kind of national level, but also devolved accountability for local authorities. And finally, kind of data compatibility as well, where measures do exist, they may not be comparable across different jurisdictions, and the UK data strategy, which Peter Elias mentioned earlier on, may not be taking sufficient notice of this. I think there's an issue for the data producers in terms of how do we actually produce comparable data and make sure that it's available and is of sufficient quality. A third point that occurs to me is that despite all these data problems, we've actually identified that evaluation is important, and not just important in terms of assessing the impact or effect of existing policy or service delivery, but also in terms of changing the actual direction of policy and, as Susan pointed out earlier, the nature of performance targets themselves, that actually evaluation can be important in terms of saying this is not the thing we should be focusing on, it's something else. And the nature of the data that's collected in order to improve the prospects of evaluation in the future, I think, is another thing that can be changed by good evaluation. We should be using evaluation as a mechanism for actually changing data collection itself. Evaluation isn't just a question of measurement, and especially not just quantitative measurement. And although we're a quantitative methods network, I wouldn't want anyone to leave the room thinking that we thought that that was the answer to all problems. Impact evaluation does, of course, require good and robust quantitative data, but as we've heard at various points throughout the day, without an understanding of the processes that are underpinning policy and practice, we can't assess the true value of impact. So we also need to have some element of theory, and I think it's great. I started my career in Scottish Government about 20 years ago, and at that point theory was a dirty word. People didn't talk about theory, and it's great to hear now that governments are actually using a concept of theory of change, and that logic modelling is a way to actually bring that to bear in the evaluation process. And Stephen and Erica have both stressed that theory of change is increasingly underpinning the focus of evaluation. I also thought it was refreshing to hear many people, particularly Stephen there, saying that evaluation is not just an add-on. We shouldn't just be thinking we've got some money left at the end of the budget, what can we do with it? Oh, we'll stick a bit of evaluation on. It needs to be planned into the activity itself, and it needs to have the data producers involved in that process, which means that policy is actually being developed with evaluation in mind. And I think, as Stephen pointed out at the end there, ethics is also a very key issue that we've not maybe talked so much about today, but one not to be forgotten. And ironically, many of us struggle more with presenting our data than we do with some fairly complex statistical models. And I think Ricky's provided some really great advice and tools and services and support suggestions on where we can go to look at ways in which we might want to present our data a little bit more. So in terms of where we go next, first of all, I hope that from what you've heard today that you've taken away some useful information and advice, even if that advice is complicated. Secondly, I think what we'll do as AQMeN is we'll set up a forum on the website for question and answer, which you might want to use if there's been something that's been a burning question today that you haven't had the opportunity to raise, and you may want to make that question known. We'll set up a forum on the website. We already have fora, so we'll just make a specific one for this event, so that perhaps the discussion could be ongoing. I think also we'll take some of the key issues that have been raised today back to the original group who raised this whole question in the first place to look at, well, where can we go next, and see whether there's more that can be done to support public service delivery through effective evaluation. As I mentioned earlier, we will be circulating a link to an electronic survey, and the main purpose of that will be to develop a training event. So please, if you feel that training in this area is something that you would benefit from, do please fill out that form and tell us what kind of areas of training you feel you would benefit from, and we'll attempt to develop something next year. We're also in the course of developing another data visualization course next year, and I think we can probably try to include Ricky in that too, so more kind of practical, how do you actually do all of this kind of stuff. And finally, I just wanted to kind of reiterate something that Peter Elias said. The Secondary Data Analysis Initiative, which is due to be launched later on this year, the ESRC itself has been a great proponent of trying to develop methodology as an issue, not just quantitative methodology, but all methodology, and they've poured an enormous amount of resource into funding some really excellent projects right across the UK. This Secondary Data Analysis Initiative, I think, is a really good one. I'm going to go down to London at the beginning of December to hear a bit more about it and put something on the website, but I would really like to encourage some of the academic and non-academic members of AQMeN to think about ways in which this might be used to develop some kind of projects in Scotland. So finally, I did promise 5 minutes. I've gone 1 minute over, but I'd just like to say thanks to you all for coming. Thanks to all our speakers. I think all the presentations today have been really excellent. Thanks to the organisers, particularly, and thanks to my co-chair, Lindsay, and the people behind the scenes that make it all possible, Jackie, Angie, Heather and Helen. And finally, thanks to the RSC for putting us up with us for today. Thank you very much for coming. Congratulations.